everyone. This is Dr. Benner from the Shelbourne Knee Center podcast. Welcome back for our next episode. Today, we're going to be talking about return to sport and subsequent injury rates after revision ACL reconstruction. And Scott Bauman's here with me from our office, and he'll be asking a lot of questions of me about this study. If you want to hit us up on our social, you can find us on our Instagram and Twitter handles at the SKC Podcast, or you can find us at the Shelbourne Knee Center Podcast Facebook page, or you can email us if you'd like to ask any questions at the skcpodcast@gmail.com.
This will be a great episode to back up to last week. For those that listened last week with Dr. Haro from South Carolina, we had a great discussion recapping the article that he wrote with Dr. Shelbourne, looking at subsequent injury and re-tears for both knees after primary ACL reconstructions. And we had a great discussion on what leads to higher graft tears and what leads to higher contralateral tears, whether that be age, activity level, male, female, those types of things, which was a great discussion. If you haven't heard it yet, go back to last week's episode and listen to episode 15 with Dr. Haro. And again, this week is going to be a good backup to that, because we're going to be talking about the return to sport and subsequent injury rates for revision ACL reconstructions, specifically highlighting a article that Dr. Benner was an author of, along with Dr. Shelbourne and Tinker Gray, from the American Journal of Sports Medicine in 2014, titled Return to Sports and Subsequent Injury Rates After Revision Anterior Cruciate Ligament Reconstruction with Patellar Tendon Autograft. Again, highlighting the difference between maybe the revision setting compared to the primary setting from last week. So to kick this off, Dr. Benner, just start from the beginning, and can you talk about what the rationale for conducting this study was?
Yeah, this was an interesting one for me, because this was actually when I was a fellow when I started to think about this and kind of kick this project off. I read an article about return to sport rates after revision ACL reconstruction from another institution, and they reported about 50% return to sport rates, but they used a variety of different grafts. If I remember right, it was about 50-50 whether they used allografts or autografts, and it was at a time when there was still a little bit of unknown about the performance of allografts really in primary and revision surgery, where I think now the Mars group and some of the other subsequent research that's been done about ACL revision reconstructions has shown pretty clearly that autografts seem to do a better job in avoiding re-tear rates and failure rates. But at the time, there was still a lot of people using allografts. This was in 2011, I believe, was when that study came out. And this is a nice thing about having a background in of a research department at your office that you could tap into. A lot of the studies that we do at our office are ones that we read things and hear about things at meetings and elsewhere that are of interest and related to the work that we've done previously. And then we have an opportunity to go back to our research database and look it up ourselves and see if we agree or disagree, see if there's any changes. And given that I had been around Dr. Shelbourne and Tinker, who used to be in our research department, that did a lot of publishing with Dr. Shelbourne over the years, I thought that we might be able to answer this question specifically for patella tendon autografts. And that's really where what the genesis of this study was, is reading a study that reported 50% return to sport rates from revision ACL reconstructions with both autografts and allografts, and wondering whether autograft patella tendons in the entire population could make a difference.
Now, knowing that background, did you have a specific hypothesis for what you thought was going to be the return to sport rates and the subsequent injury rates for this population?
You know, this wasn't really a comparison study, a direct comparison study. So I guess my hypothesis would have been at the time that autograft re-tear rates or failure rates would be better, especially with patella tendons, than a mixture of autografts and allografts, or mixing grafts and then looking at the results. But we didn't have a comparison group, so that's one limitation, I think, from the very beginning. This study is definitely not looking at a group of autografts and a group of allografts trying to establish superiority of one over the other. This was a little bit earlier on in the process before I think we get to a point where we start doing those kind of comparison studies, where people just publish their level 4 evidence and then try to compare them study to study. Now, that as you start to make those comparisons, that's the time when those comparative studies can really come out, and we can really put it to the test in a better way.
Now, obviously, this study is specifically looking at revision surgery with patients with a patella tendon autograft. Just a quick question before we get started into the methods of this study. When you have a patient that comes in with a variety of graft choices from their first surgery, whether it be allograft, hamstring, quad tendon, patella tendon graft from the same side, what's your thought process? And is it any different when you get a patient that comes in with one graft versus the other when it comes to making the decision for a revision surgery?
Well, at our office, as you know, Scott, we really do 100% patella tendon grafts. So the discussion of which graft are we going to use is a pretty easy one for us because we use the same graft all the time. And that's a discussion for another day, probably on, the way we look at it, where we choose the graft that we think is the best one and use it all the time versus others like to look at some pluses and minuses of each different type of graft and apply those then to different populations or to different situations to see if they can find a fit of a specific graft to a specific patient. In our opinion, the patella tendon graft's the best graft, and that's probably a discussion for another day. But especially when it comes to revision surgery, I think it's really important to use whatever you believe to be the best available graft. The idea that we're going to have a surgery that either fails or re-tears and we go to a second ACL surgery, to me, really demands that we use the best possible graft. So in that regard, if there are any shortcomings of the graft, which I believe at the time, and I definitely believe now that there's been subsequent research that's agreed with us that allografts have that autografts have better outcomes after revision surgery. I really think we owe it to our patients that if we're going to do a second reconstruction, another rehabilitation, potential for complications, etc., that we go about it with the best possible graft. And in our hands, that's the patella tendon autograft. If you're listening to this and saying, you know what, I think hamstrings are better, that's fine. You're of course welcome to that opinion. If you're going into the revision situation, in my opinion, use autograft tissue regardless of what type it is. The other thing that we like to think about at our office is using the same side graft or an opposite side graft. And the interesting thing is using the graft from the opposite knee, doing contralateral patella tendon graft ACL reconstruction really came from our experience doing revisions. Dr. Shelbourne, like everybody else at the time that was doing patella tendon grafts, was taking the graft from the same knee and was getting good results and happy with how things were going. Unfortunately, some of those patients retore, and then if you're a patella tendon graft surgeon, you want to get a patella tendon graft and you've already taken one from the injured knee, then a lot of times they would go to the opposite knee, and that's where you started to notice some specific advantages for taking the graft from the other knee in the primary situation. For us, it's an easy decision because we use contralateral grafts anyway, that if somebody comes into our office and they've had a previous patella tendon graft or a previous hamstring graft or allograft or whatever, the contralateral patella tendon is the one that we usually go to. Now, in our patients, if we've already taken a contralateral graft and they have unfortunately retorn, then we would use an ipsilateral graft, same side graft for the revision situation. And that's really, for me, the majority of the ipsilaterals that I do are revisions of ones that we've done the primary surgery. For revisions that come to us from elsewhere for the primary surgery, we're usually using contralateral patella tendons.
Now, I'm not going to have you speak for other surgeons here, but from what you've talked to with colleagues of yours or heard at meetings, if a different surgeon has a patient coming in with an ipsilateral patellar tendon graft that has retorn and there's going to be a revision surgery, what do you see as the most popular graft choice for that nationwide? Is it contralateral patellar tendon graft, or do they go with a hamstring, or what?
I think that's an evolving science. The quadriceps tendon graft seems to be picking up a lot of steam just because it's such a thick graft. It's plenty of collagen, plenty of tissue to be able to use for the revision situation. So I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, but I think the pendulum has swung back and forth over the last 15, 20 years from people saying, you know what, for a secondary reconstruction, maybe we're going to use allograft tissue because we don't want to put the patient through a more arduous rehabilitation the second time around, to people figuring out that unfortunately they do have a little bit higher re-tear rates, higher failure rates, and that the success rate is better by using autograft tissue. And I agree with that 100%, that if you're going to go for a revision situation, you need the best tissue possible, and autograft is the way to go.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing that. Let's jump right into this study. What was the methodology that you used for this, and what were the outcomes that you were assessing?
Well, when we designed this study, we really did it with Dr. Haro and Dr. Shelbourne's patients from last week, that study about re-injury rates and return to sport rates from primary ACL reconstruction really in mind. And we wanted to look at that in a lot of the same way. So the easy part was just to look at, do these patients get back to competitive sport at the level they were before? Yes or no? And we really made it as simple as that. But we wanted to also separate it between competitive school age kids. So these are high school athletes, competitive collegiate athletes, and then recreational athletes that are older. As we know, those have different ACL re-tear or opposite knee tear rates, but they also return to sport at different rates. So we wanted to really know what the return to sport rate was in each of those categories. And then when it came to the incidence of ACL tear to the opposite knee or to the same knee for, I guess after this one, it would be a third time, we wanted to look at it along those same lines as well. School age athletes, so high school athletes, collegiate athletes, and then recreational athletes in the same way that we separated it for Dr. Haro's paper that we presented last week. And then the numbers on that, we had 96 school age athletes, 68 college athletes, and 138 recreational athletes. We lost a few to follow up, so we ended up with groups of 84 high school athletes with a mean age of 16.6, 58 collegiate athletes with a mean age of 21.9, and 117 recreational athletes with a mean age of 28. So then we looked at our re-injury rates for the same knee and for the opposite knee for each of those groups. We also looked at side-to-side KT1000 maximum manual differences between those three groups, as well as IKDC subjective scores and Cincinnati knee rating scores, both in the long term, and then we compared those between groups.
So knowing you look at those 3 or 4 different outcomes, what were the results that you found with this study?
Well, first, when we looked at the return to sport rates, the return to sport rates were pretty good. They were 74% of the school age athletes returned to play the same sport in high school, and 24% of those 62 athletes went on to play at the collegiate level. So pretty good return to sport rates. And as it compared to the early study that showed about 50-50 on whether or not those athletes got back to playing, we found that with autograft patella tendons, 74% of people who had revision ACL reconstruction were able to get back to the same sport in high school. In the collegiate athletes, that held to be the same percentage, exactly 74% returned to play the same sport at the collegiate level. And a couple of those even went on to play in the professional ranks. Of the recreational athletes, 62% returned to the same sport at a recreational level post-surgery. So the recreational athletes returned to sport at a little bit lower rate. And I think that's pretty easy to be able to explain. The high school and collegiate athletes that still have competitive time that they're playing for a school team were more likely to come back than the recreational athletes who have now, in this study, have had 2 ACL surgeries. And I think many of them just said, you know what, I think that's probably enough, and were less likely to return to sport than the other groups. As for a subsequent ACL injury to either knee after surgery between the three groups, when we looked at the school age group, we found that only 2.3% of patients had a subsequent ACL tear in the same knee in the school age group. In the collegiate group, it was 5.1%, and in the recreational sport group, it was 3.4%. So a lower level of re-injury than we talked about in Dr. Haro's paper last week to the ACL knee. As for the contralateral knee, the contralateral ACL tear rates were also lower in this study than the previous study looking at return from primaries. School age athletes tore their opposite ACL only 1.1% of the time, collegiate athletes only 1.7% of the time, and recreational athletes also 1.7% of the time. None of those were statistically significantly different between groups, but they do seem to be a trend, although it wasn't a direct comparison to the previous study. They do seem to be a trend to lower rates of injury to both the reconstructed knee and to the opposite knee after a return from revision ACL reconstruction versus a return from primary ACL reconstruction. As for the other objective parameters, there was no difference between the three groups with KT side-to-side manual maximal difference. There was a trend that was statistically significant for slightly lower IKDC and Cincinnati knee rating scores for the recreational group, although there was no difference between the school age and the collegiate athletes. They had good scores that were not statistically different. When the recreational athletes were looked at as a separate group, they did have statistically significantly lower IKDC and Cincinnati rating scores.
I want to go back to the two primary outcome measures, the two that are in the title of the study, the return to sport and subsequent injury rates for this population. Focusing first on the subsequent injury rates, and I think you made a good point that the numbers that you saw in this revision study were actually less than the numbers we talked about with Dr. Haro last week with the primary surgeries. You're talking school age at 2.3% for subsequent ACL tear. College age sports were 5.1 and recreational sports were 3.4. I did find it interesting that in some of these populations, like the high school athletes that you would think that are entering back into a quote unquote dangerous level of sport because they're so young and they're playing these higher level sports. What's your thoughts on why that is almost cut in half from the study we talked about last week?
It's interesting when you get into the numbers and try to think about the timelines involved here. So if you're talking about a school age athlete, that this is their second ACL surgery and the mean age is 16.6. So when somebody has a primary ACL, has an ACL tear, has a primary ACL reconstruction, and they return to sport, some of them are eighth graders, freshmen. Some of them are seniors where they are juniors where they only have one season left, and then they're no longer playing competitive sport and their risk of re-injury goes down. So this group in particular are looking at people who have already had a primary ACL reconstruction, retorn, and now had a secondary ACL reconstruction. So the athletic exposures remaining after you've had two ACL tears is probably less than after you've had one ACL tear, just as a function of time. And really the same thing holds true for the opposite knee as well, just that because the timeline is such that if these people have already been through two ACL reconstructions and they're returning to sport, they probably don't have as much of their competitive athletic career remaining. And because of that decrease in athletics exposures versus coming back from primary surgery and lower re-injury rates.
And for similar reasons, but a little bit different, just mentioning athletic exposures, I want to go back to the other primary outcome of return to play at the same level. Now, with high school and college, they're both at 74%, which I think is fantastic compared to what else is in the literature, which I believe you said is right around 50% return. And I think it makes sense that the recreational athletes are going to be a little bit lower for obvious reasons. You're coming back from a second ACL tear. You might be 35 playing recreational basketball. Decisions to play at the same level may be personal more so than even how your knee is functioning. And so I guess my first question is, what's your thoughts overall on the numbers, especially for the younger crowd, the high school and college athletes being 74% compared to what's been previously in the literature right around 50?
Well, I think if you look at the previous study that I was referencing, from 2011, that looked at return to sport rates from revision surgery, it reported about 50%. In addition to the Moon Group data, which shows across the Moon Group, which is a multi-center study, as everyone knows, looking at primary ACL reconstruction outcomes, that group even reports about 50-60% return to sport rates from primary ACL reconstruction. So I think having 74% of young athletes come back to their sport at the same level with a patella tendon graft after revision surgery is fantastic, and we were happy about that, definitely.
Now, another thing I wanted to talk to you about was if somebody's looking at this, it's in table 2, and I was reviewing this earlier and saw that the time for return to sport after surgery in months for the for the high school athletes was 6.4 months, college sports 7.1 months, and recreational athletes at 6.6 months. Knowing that this is a revision setting, I find that these are still on the faster side, even of primaries. This is not as quick as what I would say our primaries get back to, as we've talked about in episodes past. Specifically the contralateral study that we had published not too long ago, our average was under 6 months. So this is definitely an average that's a month or so more so than some of the primaries we're seeing. But if you look at this as a whole, I think when you talk to somebody, they're probably not getting revisions back this quickly. I don't even think some people are getting primaries back this quickly. So touch a little bit on what you're seeing even now when you're having athletes go back after a revision surgery.
Well, the kind of fascinating thing is I feel like patients get back really quickly with regard to range of motion after revision surgery. I do not feel like patients get back more slowly from a rehab perspective in the revision situation versus the primary situation. And that's something that I think is a kind of a dogmatic thing that all of us talk about, that, oh, you're having revision surgery. This is probably going to take a little bit longer than your first time. And when I see these patients back, I expect them to progress a little more slowly, but they don't, especially not from a range of motion standpoint. However, I think when you have an initial first-time ACL reconstruction and people want to get back to sport, there's always this kind of competitive nature of how quick can I get back? How good of a rehab person am I as the athlete returning to sport? That's not even necessarily something that we're pushing on them. It's something that people push on themselves on how quickly can I get back, versus after you have a revision surgery. I think people, even though I think they progress just as quickly, I just don't think people feel like they're in that much of a hurry. They feel like, I've already had 2 injuries. Maybe they're thinking about whether they even want to get back and play or not at all, let alone how quickly they get back and play. So I think it just speaks to the mental state and the kind of taking stock of their athletic career that a lot of these athletes go through, that they're maybe a little bit slower after revision surgery than they are after primary surgery.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one thing that I'm glad you said was the being mentally prepared aspect of it. From a physical therapy standpoint, I completely agree, especially in the early going, the first couple months after surgery, the patients progress really quickly. And I've always chalked that up to they know what to expect. Unfortunately, this is their second time, but there's a lot to go through with a surgery like this. And if you have that expectation of having gone through this before, I think the early stages are, to be honest with you, I think they're easier for the patient. But I do think that the later stages is much more difficult, but not because of physical reasons. And I think you hit the nail on the head with that. I think it's purely because they are fearful, they're more anxious. And like you said, they might be at a point where their career is either changing drastically, where they're graduating out of school and they're going to go from a competitive level to a recreational level, or recreational level to, hardly anything. So I think that's a good point to make.
I also think the majority of the athletes are wanting to get back to their sport, especially if they still have competitive years left. But there are some that start to question, do I really want to do this, especially depending on what level of athletics they're playing. I took care of Purdue University, a Division I university, for 10 years, and I also take care of Wabash College at the Division III level. And I will say, at the Division III level, where these guys are usually playing for fun, nobody's going to go play in the NFL or the NBA coming from Wabash College. No offense, guys, if you're listening, but just not happening. That a lot of those athletes are pretty pragmatic about, what, if I get back, that's great. If I don't get back, it's not that big of a deal. I have other things to do. I'm trying to finish my education, get a job, go on with my life, versus at the Division I level, where I think everybody has professional, or the majority of those athletes have professional aspirations of some sort, that maybe they're a little more likely to see themselves getting back to sport, but be a little nervous about whether or not they're going to be able to do it, and a little bit slow to return. I think that's even changed in the last few years, as there's been more involvement of agents and advisors and NIL money and things of that nature, in addition to just a culture of some college athletes deciding, I only want to play on a limited basis until I can show that I'm still good and then I've gotten back from injury, and then I want to shut down because I'm worried that I'm going to injure myself again and hurt my draft status, or hurt my first contract, or hurt my ability to play in the pros and look bad in front of scouts, etc. I think that's a whole new thing that I know my last couple of years at Purdue were different in that regard, not specific to Purdue, just in talking to other team physicians in the Big Ten that we would work with as well. Just adds a whole new element to the return to sport process.
What does your involvement look like, and how is your conversation at that stage with the athlete? Let's take this example at the more higher level athletes, so high competition varsity athletes in high school and college players. Mm-hmm. What's your involvement and what's your conversation look like when it comes to primaries versus revisions? And my first question is it any different at that same stage? And what's your tactics for that? Are you keeping things objective and just telling it like it is, or how do you counsel that patient at that time?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's the initial kind of emotional reaction to, oh my gosh, I'm hurt again, and that's always just a difficult thing because usually the athletes kind of know what's going on when they hurt themselves. Although a lot of them are in denial. I always get worried when an athlete comes into my office who had a primary ACL reconstruction and says, well, it didn't feel like the first time. Absolutely no, I don't think I tore my ACL again. It didn't feel like the first time. I didn't swell as much, wasn't as painful. And I'm always thinking in the back of my mind as I have that conversation with them, they're trying to convince themselves that they haven't hurt themselves as much as they know that they just did. And it's a natural reaction to have, obviously. But when people start talking about, you know what, it wasn't as bad though, so maybe I'm okay. A lot of times that makes me feel worse instead of better, unfortunately. But there is a little bit more of an emotional, almost kind of grieving process that people have to go through when they hurt themselves again to get to the point where they're sad and then they're angry, and then eventually they come around and have to get mentally prepared. So I don't really put any different surgical readiness, bounds around that. And that once they're ready from a motion and swelling standpoint, we'll move on and go ahead. But I do think that process is a little bit different, getting mentally prepared for revision surgery.
Now, knowing that the return to sport time is a little bit longer for revisions versus primaries, a question I have for you from a technical standpoint, is that time at all tied to any type of concomitant injuries, or do you see more of those in the revision settings, things like more severe chondral damage or meniscus tears that you don't typically see in the primary setting? Is there something that stands out to you from a surgical technique or surgical standpoint that you see more of those type of injuries that may lead to them getting back longer?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that if we looked at our data, we would find more chondral and meniscal injuries for obvious reasons. If they've had a primary ACL reconstruction, we know that a certain amount of those people have to have meniscus treatment, and some of that requires, partial meniscectomy. Obviously, people who come for a first-time ACL reconstruction are much less likely to have had a prior meniscectomy than people who are coming for revision surgery. So with that comes potential for a little mild joint space narrowing, comes potential for some mild lower degree chondral defects before they enter the revision situation. And of course, none of that is going to get any better. It might not get worse, but it definitely isn't getting better when it comes to comparing those two groups. So I think that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind, that these patients are more likely to have had meniscal treatment previously, potentially even partial meniscus resection, chondral wear and tear that the people don't have as often or as to the significant degree as people in the primary situation did.
So I think you did a great job highlighting the outcomes and what this study shows. Were there any limitations that needed to be addressed with this study?
Yeah, no doubt. This study definitely has some limitations. It's a single surgeon, single clinic cohort. So this may or may not be reproducible if people use other types of grafts, if people use other types of rehabilitation techniques. Specifically with return to sport rates, a lot of surgeons I know have slowed down significantly on their primary ACL reconstruction, return to sport progression, let alone the revision situation. I think people are a lot more likely to wait longer to let people get back to sport and we're not necessarily that way. So this may not necessarily be reproducible everywhere. And I would encourage everyone to follow their own research, their own data, and collect information on their own patients to back that up. This also is not a comparative study. We're not saying with this study that we took a look at a group of people that had allografts or hamstrings or quadriceps tendons, and we found patella tendons has specific advantages over them. That would be the most elegant study design, especially if it was done in a randomized controlled fashion of some sort. But that kind of data is not out there. There is some comparative data, though, subsequent to the study that we did, which was about 8 or 10 years ago. There has been subsequent study. I'd point people in the direction of the MARS group, the Multicenter ACL Revision Study, I believe was the acronym there. But the MARS group has done some work in this same realm with a multicenter study that has shown, similarly to the Moon group in the primary ACL reconstruction realm, that there is a higher degree of failure and re-tear rates with allografts as opposed to autografts. It's definitely important to keep those limitations of this study in mind.
So overall, what is your take-home message or final thoughts on this study?
Well, I think it's maybe a little bit counterintuitive to what we might have thought about this study. If you ask people just in general, do you think people are going to get back at a 75% rate for competitive athletes? I think most people would probably say no. I think if you ask people about subsequent injury rates, do you think you're going to have a harder time with failure rates or repeat injury rates if people go back to sports after a revision reconstruction? I think the answer would probably be yes, but that is not what we found. And I think we talked in this episode about some reasons why it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, but the point still holds that I thought there was some interesting findings from this study. And as we've stated several times, and many other authors have, for me in the revision situation, if you're going to go to the extent of doing a revision ACL reconstruction, you want the best possible graft. For me, that's a patella tendon, but I think in general it's autograft tissue. And if you're a hamstring surgeon or a quadriceps surgeon, tendon surgeon for ACL reconstruction, use the graft that you think is the best one of the patient's tissue in the revision situation.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great study. I appreciate you taking the time to go through that in detail with us to highlight those outcomes for patients that are having revision surgery. As always, you can contact us in a variety of ways. We're on Twitter and Instagram at the SKC Podcast. We're on our YouTube and Facebook page for the SKC Podcast. You can also email us at the skcpodcast@gmail.com. And we would love to hear from you in any of those ways, whether you want to comment and let us know how we're doing on Apple Podcasts so other people can see that, or let us know in the comments section on social media regarding the episodes, whether it's a way that you treat patients in a similar way or in a different way and what type of outcomes you guys are getting. So love to hear from you, and we will talk to you guys next week.